advanced study, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Institute this afternoon for this lecture. Today our speaker is Glen Bowersock. Glen is a leading authority on Greek, Roman and Near Eastern history. He has been a professor at the Institute for Advanced Study for 26 years, by some way the most senior professor in the School of Historical Studies. And on the 1st of July this year, he will become Professor Emeritus. Over a career spanning more than 4 decades so far, Glen has published some 300 articles and more than a dozen books, from Greek sophists in the Roman Empire in 1969 through Julian the Apostate in 1978, fiction's history in 1994 to martyrdom and Rome in 2002. Glen obtained his bachelor's degree from Harvard in 1957 before going to Oxford to study the classical course there, and then staying on to take an Oxford doctorate in 1962. Then he returned to the United States to join the faculty at Harvard, where he served not only as Professor of Classics and History, but also as Chairman of the Department of Classics and then Associate Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences before coming to the Institute. His distinction has been very widely recognized, of course, for example, by his election to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and to the American Philosophical Society, his election as an honorary fellow of his Oxford College, Balliol, and by his appointment as a Chevalier of the Légion d'Honneur. He's also been elected a foreign member of academies in France, Italy, and Russia. Today, Professor Bowersock's title is The Three Romes.
Thank you very much, Peter. I thank my precious colleagues here at the Institute, the many, many friends with a capital F and a small f who are sitting in the audience today, and many of you in both categories of friends with a large F and a small f, and so many other colleagues and friends from the university and the academic community around Princeton. It is a great pleasure to be here, and I hope I will have something to say that will engage you or interest you. I'm doing it the old-fashioned way, with words only. This is a tale of 3 cities. As with Dickens too, it concerns the best of times and the worst of times, epochs of belief and epochs of incredulity, the spring of hope and the winter of despair. In short, as Dickens put it, very like the present period. The grandiose upheavals of the Romes of this world constitute a lesson in myths of imperialism, the fragility of power, the impermanence of permanence, and the magic of a name. In the 1st century of the 16th century, a Russian monk, Philophe, or Philotheus in the Greek form, at the monastery of Eleazar in Pskov, wrote to his Tsar, Vasily III, "2 Romes have fallen, but the 3rd stands, and a 4th shall never be." This apocalyptic utterance, addressed to the ruler in Moscow, asserts that his city is not merely Tsargrad, the city of the Tsar, but Rome, the 3rd Rome. The name and glory, signifying the capital of Christianity, had, according to Philophe, long since departed from Italian Rome, whence it had passed to Byzantium, which took the name of Constantinople and soon became the 2nd Rome. But with the fall of that great city on the Bosporus before the Ottoman Turks in 1453, a little over half century before Philophe wrote, Moscow could now lay claim to the ancient name and all that it entailed. The monk was right. There never has been, and presumably never will be, a 4th Rome. The original city survives today, of course, under its own name, but Constantine's city, Constantinople or Constantinoupolis in Greek, is no longer the second Rome. Yet even there, the memory lingers in the Turkish word Rum and its adjective Rumeli. For Rum is nothing more than the word Rome, yet its meaning is Constantinople, or as it was also known, Byzantium. So linguistically at least, the second Rome never died. But when the Muslim Turks conquered the city, it inevitably ceased to be a Christian capital, and this allowed Moscow to claim its name on behalf of Orthodox Christianity. The potency of the concept and the name of Rome cuts across the ancient and medieval Mediterranean world and unites the Byzantine Empire with the Slavs who came into contact with it. The implications of a sovereign city with its dependent peoples arose in the ancient Roman Republic when myth-makers and poets strove to explain and to justify the emergence of the Roman state at the expense of the indigenous peoples of Italy, such as Etruscans and Sabines. When Constantine transferred the seat of empire to Byzantium, once he had emerged victorious over the successors of Diocletian at the beginning of the 4th century, he left the Pope, the Vicar of Christ in Rome, but moved the city's ideological baggage to the east. And in doing so, it turned out that he unwittingly transferred the darkest fears of Augustan Rome into harsh reality. For after the defeat of the Egyptian queen Cleopatra at Actium in 31 BC and her well-known death through the asp that she pressed to her bosom, the Romans had wanted to prove that they, after all, were not a decadent nation of the eastern Mediterranean. But they had a hard job doing this. And we can reasonably begin our examination of the idea of Rome with the issue of Roman identity. The Romans, despite their name, considered themselves foreigners in Italy, and so did the rest of the Mediterranean world. The legend of Aeneas' arrival on the shores of Latium left no doubt that he and his comrades were refugees from Troy and the Trojan War. They came, therefore, from Asia Minor, a region that in Cicero's day was considered the home of effete, not to say effeminate, people, so different from the Romans themselves. Their ancestors came from even farther east than Cleopatra herself. Yet they had taken over a native population, and they ultimately displayed among the descendants of the invader Aeneas a local founder called Romulus, who had a twin brother, Remus. This is the famous pair that owed its survival to the nurturing milk of a local she-wolf. It is impossible to clear away the mists from these exceedingly old stories, but it's worth observing that Trojan Aeneas is alleged to have produced, some hundreds of years afterwards, an eponymous hero with a Greek name. Romulus, after all, appears to be formed from the Greek word for strength, Romi, which was in fact to become the Greek name for the city of Rome itself, Romi. And Romulus' twin brother Remus had the name Romus in many traditions. An important part of the myth of Rome, as the Romans developed it, was its eternal character. Roma aeterna, eternal Rome, was an effective counterbalance to the story of occupation and conquest by presumably Hellenized and probably Greek-speaking Trojans. The invaders set up a city for all time. But to be sure, the word aeternus in Latin was formed from aetas, which simply means age, either in reference to a person or to a chronological period. So Aeternus anticipated continuity over time, but not necessarily lasting forever. Rather, one might say, into the foreseeable future. Even Cicero, in the 1st century BC, when the ideology of Rome had become well established, could address the possibility of the city's collapse. If you want this city to be immortal, he proclaimed, if you want this empire to be eternal, if you want sempiternal glory, and notice the addition of the element semp for always to eternal, sempiternal glory, we must protect ourselves from our desires, from disruptive persons who crave revolution, from internal strife, from self-interested counsel. Good advice, which the Romans didn't heed. So there was a present danger that eternal Rome might one day disappear. When the Emperor Augustus tried to put the pieces of the state back together again after the terrible civil war with Antony and the struggle against Cleopatra, he had to give careful thought to the perpetuation of the world he had just won. Two of the greatest poets of the age addressed the issue in famous verses, which will be known to many of you, I'm sure. In the first book of his Aeneid, which was to become the authoritative account of the legend of Aeneas' foundation of Rome, Virgil assigned to Jupiter those sonorous and portentous lines in which he foretells that a descendant of Aeneas, a priestess called Aelia, with a name formed from Ilium, an ancient name for Troy itself, would give birth to Romulus and to his twin brother. For them, says Jupiter, I place no limit of space or time upon their nation. I have given them empire without end. His ego nec metas rerum nec tempore pono, imperium sine fine dedi. But at the end of the Aeneid, 12 books later, Jupiter's consort, Juno, brings up the dreaded prospect of a rebirth of Troy. In a famous line, she declared, Troy has fallen, and let it stay fallen, without a name. Occidit, occidiritque sinas sine nomine Troia. She had hated the Trojans from the time the gods fought with each other over the Trojan War itself. And as Virgil shows, she did her best to make the Trojan journey to Italy just as difficult and as miserable as possible. She wanted to ensure that the race of Aeneas was firmly rooted in Italy and safely out of the eastern Mediterranean. This ironclad image of the westernization of former Trojans obviously suited the Romans, who could now represent themselves as indigenous Italians, very much like the British colonists who became Americans in the New World. It was in the Emperor Augustus' best interest to flaunt Juno's interdict on the refounding of Troy. The contemporary lyric poet Horace, in a magnificent ode, conjured up Juno to deliver an apocalyptic speech on the circumscribed nature of Rome's eternity. Her speech begins with an incantatory repetition of Troy's old name, Ilion, that I've mentioned, which will be best known, of course, from the title of the Iliad. Juno recalls the judgment of Paris and Helen's beauty. Ilion, Ilion, a fateful and incestuous judge and a foreign woman have turned into dust. Ilion, Ilion, fatalis incestusque iudex, et mulier peregrina vertit in pulverem. Rome will stand, Juno declares, as long as the vast sea lies between Troy and Rome, and herds of animals roam over the tombs of Paris and Priam. The capital will stand, as Rome dictates laws to the Medes, but only on condition that the Romans never try to rebuild their ancestral city of Troy. So mindful of this potent ideological myth, Augustus dispatched a colony of Roman veterans to settle in a city that was near but not in Old Troy, a city called Alexandria Troas and named for Alexander the Great in the territory of Troy. This colony was clearly apotropaic, that is, to ward off any potential collapse by clearly separating Rome from her eastern origins and demonstrating her role as ruler of the Mediterranean world. Eternal Rome, Roma Aeterna, was thus dependent upon her western identity. Hence, what happened a little more than 300 years later was an uncanny, if unanticipated, fulfillment of Juno's malediction. When Constantine assumed uncontested leadership of the entire Mediterranean Empire in 324, after the defeat of his last rival, Licinius, he had already settled on the great city on the Bosporus for his imperial capital, and he had already embarked on the road to making his empire a Christian state. We know that whatever the nature of his conversion at the Milvian Bridge in 312, something happened about that time that brought the Christians' God into competition with those gods that Constantine esteemed, above all Apollo and the sun. Accordingly, once he accepted that the Christians' God was a jealous God who would have no others beside him, the die was cast. Byzantium, soon to be renamed Constantinople, was poised to become the new Rome. We've seen that Rome, the city of Romulus and Remus by the Tiber, had been the center of an imperial republic that subsequently became a monarchy ruling over most of the Mediterranean world. Yet even although the emperors governed their empire from Rome, the spread of the Roman citizenship, which became almost universal in the 3rd century, had led to the appropriation of the Roman name, in the Greek form Romaios or Romaioi as an adjective for or noun for Greeks in the Eastern Mediterranean. This was, as I mentioned at the start, the antecedent of the Turkish Rum. As Christianity gained adherents, the old word Hellene, which was the word for Greek, became increasingly convenient as a designation for a pagan and less frequent as a name for Greek. Interesting shift in meaning. As the Greeks become Romans, they identify themselves as Greeks by using the word Roman. The word that used to mean Greek, Hellene, becomes more often than not a word that indicates simply pagan. Since the Greeks had called themselves Roman well before Constantine created his new capital along with its new religion, everything was in place for a more dramatic transformation of both the name and the reality of Rome itself. The city of Byzantium that Constantine renamed in May of 330 took its name directly from him. And so it has been called until modern times when it became Istanbul, although it is still Constantinople in Greek today. In the 15th century, Lorenzo Valla could invoke the confusion of Byzantium with Constantinople in the fraudulent donation of Constantine as one of his most powerful arguments against the authenticity of that notorious document. The extension of the old name Stambul from an ancient quarter within the city to the name of Istanbul for the whole city came in the wake of the reforms of Kemal Atatürk. Yet after Constantine, the city was long known under the name Rome throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. Now, the annals of scholarship are full of disquisitions on the emergence and implications of Rome as a name for Constantinople. It was clearly not Constantine who introduced the name for his new city, nor presumably would the emperor have been much interested in a name that would eclipse his own in the resonant compound Constantinopolis. But the implications of his new foundation for the reputation of old Rome in Italy were not lost on the Eastern Greeks. It was only a matter of time before they would proclaim a new Rome or a second Rome. The earliest appearance of language of this kind occurs in a speech of the 4th century pagan orator of Constantinople, Themistius. In May of 357, he declared that the inhabited world, the Ecumeni, had two great metropoles, which he identified as the city of Romulus and the city of Constantine. The latter, he declared expressly, was the second Rome. This was clearly, at that time, an unofficial and rhetorical formulation, but it was just a few decades later, at the Council of Constantinople in 381, that Old Rome and New Rome were, according to the third canon of the existing protocol of that council, assigned comparable rank under precisely those names. Two of the Cappadocian fathers, Gregory of Nazianzus and Gregory of Nyssa, provide, with the aid of poetic license, clear proof of this rapid spread of the nomenclature of the New or Second Rome. Gregory of Nazianzus uses diction that he borrowed from Homer to call Rome on the Bosporus the younger Oplotera. And Gregory of Nyssa, in an epigram, writes of newly sprouting Rome, Neothilea Rome, or Rome. The ecclesiastical historian Socrates has no hesitation in simply naming Constantinople outright Second Rome, Deutera Romi, or Deutera Romi. Historians in late antiquity knew perfectly well the difference between Old and New Rome. But even they were conscious of the gradual evanescence of the Italian capital in the minds of Easterners. Old Rome simply receded from people's minds. The ecclesiastical historian Theodoret from Cyrus in Syria observed that Rome in Italy used to have, eschon is the verb he uses, used to have poets, historians, and orators, as if it had none anymore. The historian Procopius, in the time of Justinian, was aware of Rome's former taste for urbanization. The Romans were, he remarked, more city-loving, philopolides, than any other people, and took pride in preserving their civic memorials, both buildings and relics. And he actually cites as an example what purported to be the ship of Aeneas. But when Procopius comes to the exploits of two outstanding Roman generals, Aetius and Boniface, who he says excelled in valor and greatness of soul, he writes that it would not be wrong to call either one of them the last of the Romans. For Procopius, the city hardly existed except as an historical artifact. For those Easterners who were not historians or scholars, it seems as if the city did not exist at all. Such oubli, such utter oblivion, seems to have set in fairly soon after the association of the name Rome with Constantinople. I give you one example. A certain Muselios presented Constantinople with a museion in the early 5th century. This was a very smart pun on the man's Armenian name. Muselios is an Armenian name, but obviously museion would mean to any Greek a place comparable to the great center and library in Alexandria. Inscriptions on stone reproduce two epigrams that commemorate Muselius, and these two can be read in full in copies that are preserved in what we call the Palatine Anthology of Ancient Epigrams. But the inscribed text preserves a third epigram that describes Muselius' benefaction with a painting of the emperor inside the building, and the poet refers to the city simply as Rome, Museion Romi di Charisato. he bestowed the Mausoleum on Rome. Now this, in the early 5th century, is a remarkably early use of the bare name without any qualification, such as second or new. By the end of the 5th century, this way of referring to Constantinople had already become commonplace. The usage swept across the eastern Mediterranean world. It laid the foundation for Rome and related words as designations of Constantinople and the Byzantine Greeks, not only in Greek itself, but in other languages such as Syriac, Ethiopic, and Arabic. In Syriac texts, the city of Rome, without qualification, is regularly Constantinople, and the Romans are regularly the Byzantines. Of course, Syriac had a perfectly good word for Greeks, Iaunaie, based on Yawan for Greece, which was borrowed from the name Ionia. And even though the poet Ephraim of Nisibis had used it when he called Julian the Apostate king of the Greeks, the word did not carry the sense of pagan that Hellene did in the Greek language itself. A Syriac apocalyptic tractate from the end of the 7th century pointedly distinguishes the king of the Greeks, the Iaunaie, from the ruler of the Byzantines, who were called as normally Romans, Roumaie. Furthermore, when this same text has to refer to Old Rome, the Rome of Romulus, the writer shows clearly that he knows Romulus Rome to be different from the Rome without qualification, which is Constantinople. He is no less aware that Greeks inhabited the world of the Byzantine Romans, and so he can write, without being conscious of any paradox, of the kingdom of the Greeks, Iaunaie, which is that of the Romans, Roumaie. The source of this apparently bizarre distinction, kingdom of the Greeks, which is that of the Romans, lay in a famous verse of the biblical Psalms, in which David prophesied that on the last day of the world, an Ethiopian would stretch out his hands to God. The king, known as the Negus of Ethiopia, saw himself as a rival to the Byzantine Empire as a Christian monarch. And according to Ethiopic scripture, written many centuries later, but with a lot of early elements, I believe, and I think many do, this is the work called the Kebra Nagast, the Glory of Kings. The Ark of the Covenant had been removed to Aksum in Ethiopia to await the final day. Now, since the Negus was both Ethiopian and Monophysite, Syrian Monophysites espoused his cause in their apocalyptic literature, and hence they could distinguish between a king of the Greeks, who was Ethiopian, and a king of the Romans, who was Byzantine. Both claimed sovereignty over Greeks, but some were Orthodox Greeks and some Monophysite Greeks. In Christian Ethiopia itself, Italian Rome was utterly unknown. There the name meant only Constantinople, and the situation was similar in the Muslim world. When a city called Rome turns up in the writing of the Arab geographers, miracle stories that had their origins in the old city of Rome, descriptions of miracles within an urban context, are actually located in the topography, in the city plan of Constantinople. They knew these stories were connected with Rome, but the only Rome they knew was Constantinople, so they tried to fit them in there. Consequently, outside the texts of Greek historians, both secular and ecclesiastical, whenever Old Rome makes an appearance in the East, a clear marker is required. This normally takes the form of a generalizing reference to the inhabitants of the Western Mediterranean world to which Rome belonged. And these people often appear in late antique Greek verse as Ausonians, Ausonioi, Ausonii, a name for the Italians that fits conveniently into hexameters. In one epic poem, for example, a poet in the 5th century introduces Old Rome, Rome in Italy, only twice in the course of 48 books, and both times in conjunction with the adjective Ausonian to define that he's referring to the old Italian Rome. In the Eastern Mediterranean, general recognition of Italian Rome can only be found outside the literary milieu in the legal profession. Roman law had made a lasting impact upon the former Roman Empire, and it formed the basis for the renowned instruction in law at Beirut well into late antiquity. Gregory of Nazianzus hailed this city as the seat of Ausonian laws, and freed from metrical constraints, Gregory Thaumaturgus described Beirut with its law school as a conspicuously Roman city. Palestinian rabbis, for whom Rome remained in their collective memory as the power that had twice conquered Jerusalem, had nonetheless to acknowledge the enduring force of Roman law in their own time, and to that extent took note of old Rome. But the great legal codes of Theodosius and Justinian represented the definitive appropriation of Roman law by the Byzantine Empire, although it was ultimately in this sphere alone that the word Roman in the East continued to betray its Italian origin. We should remember that Byzantine emperors produced the law codes. The increasingly dim memory of Italian Rome in the late antique Near East can be vividly observed in the fate of the Romulus and Remus story. Centuries before, when Augustus defeated Cleopatra at Actium, he had caused a magnificent monument to be erected nearby at a modest height above his new victory city, not far from where the Battle of Actium took place, a spot that is today very close to the city of Preveza in the west coast of Greece, just off the Ionian Sea. On the terracotta moldings of this memorial at Nicopolis, the founding twins can be seen with their fostering wolf. The meaning of this image and the story that went with it would surely have been obvious to everybody at that time, the time of Augustus commemorating his victory. It celebrated the victory of Rome. Yet by the early 6th century, at a hospital in central Syria, this same image of Romulus and Remus was deployed in a mosaic at the entrance of the hospital to identify the building. The sick who stumbled across this threshold would not have sensed the slightest allusion to old Rome. The wolf was there because the wolf was giving succor to these twins, and the hospital's mission was to help the sick. No hint whatever of old Rome or Roman Empire. In fact, and rather curiously, the image of wolf and twins seems to have acquired a certain currency along the periphery of the late antique Greek East, since it is turned up amazingly in northwest Tajikistan in a 7th or 8th century Sogdian painting at a local palace near Shahristan. The dress of the figures in the scene shows that the Sogdians knew this story to belong to a foreign culture. They are wearing alien dress, but they clearly had no hesitation in borrowing these motifs because, for whatever reason, they liked them. Similarly, another painting in the same place derives from a fable by Aesop. It was the story that was appealing, a story that in no way evoked the imperial power of old Rome. As the eminent Russian art historian Boris Marshak has observed, he's published these images, the Sogdians seem to have forgotten the Western origin of such stories. The currency of the name Rome as a straightforward designation of Constantinople is nowhere more strikingly displayed than at a city in modern Jordan called Madaba, in a floor that was excavated beneath the local Church of the Virgin. There you can see personifications, rather splendid-looking women with turreted headpieces that indicate that they're personifications of cities, and these 3 cities are identified by name as Rome, Gregoria, and Madaba. Now, Madaba is clearly present as the city where the personifications were shown. This is the city in which the mosaic appears. And it's long been assumed that the other two cities must have been great ones, Rome, obviously, and the mysterious Gregoria. Although many people have tried to see these as old Rome and Constantinople, there is no reason whatever to imagine that Constantinople was ever called Gregoria. Rome at Madaba was Constantinople, and everybody in this city would have known that it was. What we don't know is where Gregoria was. This is, after all, perhaps not very surprising, despite the might of Rome in earlier epochs. Anyone who lives in Upper New York State today knows, for example, where and what Syracuse is. Except for readers of Thucydides, it is not a city in Sicily. Nor for most inhabitants of the state of Georgia does the name of Athens evoke the city of Pericles. Troy was not rebuilt, but the city founded by Constantine was close enough to the Asian shore where the Trojan War was fought to bring poignant fulfillment to Juno's dire prophecy in the days of Augustus that an eastern foundation would put an end to the Roman Empire. The Bedouin who took over the sprawling ancient remains of Palmyra in Syria can never have imagined that the huge monuments in which they pitched their tents conformed to patterns of temple architecture that had their origins far to the west in some place called Rome. If any passing traveler today were to pause to tell them this, they would immediately answer back that the monuments were Greek. But the word they would use to tell you that would sound just like Rome, Rumi. The rise of the Second Rome occurred together with the rise of a Christian empire. And although the popes in Italy knew that they resided in Rome, it was not the Rome that Eastern Christendom understood, even if certain of the attributes of the Italian city were eventually transferred to Constantinople. The 7 hills of Aeneas' Rome recur in accounts of medieval Constantinople, although only 6 can be counted there. Old Rome made some attempts to reclaim its authority in the medieval period, and perhaps the most visible was the famous forgery I've already mentioned, according to which Constantine transferred his entire Western Empire to Pope Sylvester. This notorious donation of Constantine was the work which Lorenzo Valla brilliantly and mercilessly exposed in the middle of the 15th century. The fall of Constantinople to the Crusaders in 1204 gave Italian Rome another chance to recover its old grandeur, but this only lasted till 1261, when the Greeks recovered their capital. The Second Rome continued to assert its priority. As late as the end of the 14th century, between 1394 and 1397, the Patriarch of Constantinople formally rebuked the Grand Prince of Moscow for failing to include the emperor's name on commemorative icons of the Russian Orthodox Church. The Muscovite had dared to assert, with reference to the Christian faith that Byzantium had given to the Slavs at the end of the 10th century, "We have the church, but not the emperor." To this, the Patriarch of Constantinople replied firmly, "It is not possible for Christians to have the church and not to have the empire." The proud claim of the Second Rome to a universal Christian empire was built upon the presumption that the popes in the Vatican had committed heresy by adding the Son to the Father in defining the procession of the Holy Spirit in the Nicene Creed. This is the notorious filioque clause, which is extremely tiresome to think about, but very important in these events, and by underscoring the difference through such unorthodox liturgical practices as the use of unleavened bread. But the days of Constantinople were numbered, and in 1453 it finally fell before the Turks. The last half-century of the Byzantine Empire was consumed with desperate attempts to find support against the growing threat from the Ottoman Turks. And by 1438, the Patriarch was willing to heal the rift with Old Rome in the hope of forging a badly needed alliance. The two churches were united the following year after long debates in Ferrara and in Florence, but the unity was achieved at a dangerous cost. The willingness of the Russian representative at Florence to agree to the new dispensation not only led to his disgrace at home, but prepared the way for Russia's response to the swiftly approaching fall of Constantinople. Ironically, it was at this very, very time, in 1440, that Lorenzo Valla composed his demolition of the donation of Constantine and stripped the popes of their claim to an ecclesiastical empire. 13 years later, neither the Pope nor the Patriarch of Constantinople was in any position to claim their empires. So, as the Russian Philofey wrote to his Tsar, the first and second Romes had both fallen. Since the name of Rome had become the incontrovertible symbol for Christian leadership, Moscow was now ready to take the place of Constantinople. Well before Philofey, a primate of the Russian Church had already called Moscow the new Constantinople, once the old one was in Muslim hands. And just about the time that Philofey was writing, the first printed editions of Valla's treatise on the donation were coming off the presses. Papal scholars were gradually awakening to the immense damage that Valla had done to the prestige and authority of the Vatican. Without Constantinople, Moscow had its turn. The succession of Orthodox leadership was sealed in 1472 by the marriage of Zoe, the niece of the last Paleologan Byzantine emperor, to Ivan, the Grand Prince of Moscow. And it was he who first adopted the title Tsar as the Russian equivalent of the Greek word for king, Basileus, or Vasilevs. With the title came certain coronation rites of Byzantine character, as well as a claim to autocratic rule over all Russia. Finally, the promotion of the Metropolitan of Moscow to Patriarch brought Russia into the charmed circle of 5 patriarchates from which Rome had been removed as a result of its perceived heresy. Yet for all that, Moscow had the lowest rank of the 5, and to that extent, its arrogation of the title Third Rome was less than convincing. Philofey was right that there would be no fourth Rome, and even the third lost its luster over time. Although the name would be revived on occasion for nationalistic reasons, even under the communists for whom ecclesiastical authority was obviously irrelevant, the concept of the Third Rome ought not to be advanced, as it sometimes has been, to explain an impulse to autocratic government in Russia from the 15th century to the present. There are far better explanations for this strain in Russian history, which perhaps owes more to the long domination by the so-called Golden Horde of the Mongols than it does to the Greek components of its church. In the 17th century, the patriarch Nikon scandalized the old believers when he said, "I am a Russian, but my faith and religion are Greek." And the old believers were prepared to immolate themselves in protest. But Nikon's separation of Russian identity from religious Hellenism represented the reality of the Third Rome, and that finally ensured that the way was open for the old Rome, the eternal city, to return to its former primacy. What happened can be nicely seen, I think, in the title for a very small painting by Shchedrin from the early 19th century, a work that's now in the Tretyakov Gallery in Moscow. The scene is the Castel Sant'Angelo, which is the tomb of the Emperor Hadrian in Old Rome. The image of an ancient monument in the first of the 3 Romes is identified simply as New Rome, Novi Rim. From the Third Rome, we've come back to the first, which is new all over again. The sequence of the rise and fall of empires and the peculiar instability of anything thought to be forever, prompt now some final reflections on the connotations of the epithet third. The medieval Italian mystic Gioacchino del Fiore had proposed that there were three ages of mankind conceived as parallel to the divine Trinity, and both moderns and ancients have conceived of human life as tripartite, passing from youth to middle age to old age. But in the third Rome, there is something triumphalist, as Philophae showed by invoking the fall of the two earlier cities. This was the sense in which the communists revived the expression, and this was the sense in which Hitler proclaimed his Third Reich. Similarly, Werner Jaeger declared to 20th century humanists that he was introducing the third humanism. Yet on the other hand, we have the Third Estate and the Third World, both of which are unflattering designations to the extent that they are not strictly descriptive. The Third Estate, like the French tiers état, was a euphemism for the commons or bourgeoisie, and the Third World remains a euphemism for underdeveloped and impoverished nations. There is nothing triumphalist about these designations. But I want to draw your attention to another use of third that reflects, interestingly, both the triumphalist and the euphemistic sense. And that is the phrase third age, which is widely diffused across many countries, with the signal exception of the United Kingdom and the United States, to designate their senior population, the old. Consider Italian, terza età, the third age, German, das dritte Alter, third age, French, troisième âge, Spanish, tercera edad. The expression has traveled to Russia itself with treti vosras, to Greece with triti ilikia, even to Turkey with üçüncü. The spread of this expression clearly shows that it has a positive, even triumphalist connotation, evoking the strength and wisdom of people with long years of experience. At the same time, it functions clearly as a euphemism for the old. I find it extraordinary that the English language has so far not accommodated this expression. Perhaps the Anglophone ear is too much attuned to the pejorative implications of Third World and Third Estate, and it is unacquainted with the grandeur of Third Rome. One thing is absolutely certain about all these triadic expressions, and that is, as Philophae said, there will be no fourth. No fourth Rome, no fourth world, no fourth estate, no fourth age, for that would be death itself. It is perhaps because of this frightening implication that no one can really bear to think of a third world war. It would be the last. And so, as I now move myself into the third age, I leave you with these reflections on the three Romes of the past. We can learn from them still. Thank you. The director tells me that we have time for about 5 minutes of questions or comments, objections, speeches, whatever. So I will try to spot hands that go up, if there are any. Yeah. Caroline. For journalists. Yes, okay, I think that makes the point. Thanks. Other fourths. Yeah.
Could you explain why there is no fourth?
Why there's no fourth? Well, I think it's because of this mystique of first, second, third, I mean, in the first place. And curiously, when the third Rome went effectively out of business. The old Rome came back, and as I indicated, became the new Rome rather than the fourth, since it was the original Rome. But I think the underlying explanation is the mystique of the triad. I think that is quite powerful. Anybody else? Yeah, back there. Mm-hmm. I see a hand back there. Yeah.
I was very happy to hear you reference to Atsu. Rome is described as the diminished Jerusalem.
Yes.
And Atsu is a glorious and greater Jerusalem.
Okay, thank you, Ephraim. I think that maybe that's it, Peter. Thank you.